Misfits have finalized their roster for the 2019 season, and it looks to be pretty good and pretty promising for the LCS, or I guess the LEC as it's called now, coming into the franchise season for the European League. Now, what I think is the most interesting piece in this entire roster is by far Gorilla. I think that's a crazy pickup, and it's really surprising that he would come all the way over to Europe in order to play. Now, he's been playing with Prey for so long that I'm kind of weary about calling this move just 100% good. Now, I think it will be good, and I think he will actually work well within the Misfits lineup, especially because he's playing with Hansama, someone who's a newer player, who's younger, so he'll be able to teach him a couple of things. But it's shocking that he would step away from his longtime partner in Prey, because they've been together for as long as anyone can remember. So whenever a AD carry and a support split up, they have to kind of adapt to a completely different playstyle of what they've been used to normally, and maybe they get into that mode of just automatically knowing and having a sort of intuition, because when you stick with someone for long enough, you have an intuition of how they think and what they're going to do next. So you won't really have that when you combine Hansama and Gorilla in the beginning. So it's going to take a little bit more for Gorilla to adapt to that situation and have to explain himself in his own thought process, because Hansama is not going to be able to read his mind like Prey could possibly do in certain scenarios. And then you have to consider, is his English up to par? Because that's always a concern whenever a Korean comes from LCK straight over to, say, North America or Europe. Now, from all the interviews that I've seen and that I've gathered, his English and how he understands it, at least, is actually pretty decent to a degree. So that was kind of surprising for me to look back and look through interviews and stuff. And it seems like he does understand English to a pretty good degree. And then as far as his speech of English too, it's actually decent as well. So I don't think he will have a problem with, acclimating to the English language like maybe a lot of people think he will. So that's also a bonus, and I think why he was probably picked up within this roster too. And not only that, but his play style itself is something to be looked at and say that, okay, yeah, this is a really good pickup, because he's someone who was at first an innovator. You look all the way back going to season 4, and he popularized Janna as a pick when no one else was playing her. And then he popularized Misfortune support, rip all the solo queue games, but he did this in 2016 against that famous game against SKT in the semifinals of Worlds. So he's the originator of all these different picks, and you have to consider that when looking at him moving into this team and being able to kind of bring fresh new ideas when it comes to the meta. So that in its own has a large significant value. So I think overall Gorilla can be a really strong support within this lineup. He can teach Hansama a thing or two as well, and this will be one of his big tests to see if he can actually train a newer AD carry to be really good like Prey has become. So, and then when you look at Hansama himself, he's still young in his career, right? And he can get guidance from Gorilla, and I'm sure that's really going to help out a lot. So this is great, but this is also a transition period for him, because now he's moving away from his former support. So this is going to be a little bit more tricky than just sticking with, who he had in Misfits before with Mikic. So it's going to be different for him, and Hans likes to play aggro. I mean, you could just look at his champion pool with Draven or Lucian or Xayah. These are all aggro champions and lane dominant champions. So for him to play with someone like Gorilla, who has been shown to be lane dominant as well too, especially with his Misfortune pick back in 2016 and his Zyra picks as well too, you could see that, yeah, this guy is someone who can pull out the aggro supports, but he's also someone that could play Tahm Kench or Alistar as well too and do some initiation for the team. So I think this pairing will be pretty good, and as long as Hansama is open to changing his playstyle to match Gorilla's, because he's the newer player, so he should be able to morph his playstyle more into what Gorilla wants to do, especially when it comes to Gorilla's ideas and how he wants to play the game for the entirety of the team, because as we know, supports are usually in charge of macro movements and playstyle of the team in general, along with the support, or along with the jungler as well too. So then you have to think, with Hansama being a younger player, it's always good to have someone within the entire lineup. It doesn't really matter who it is. It doesn't matter if it's an AD carry or a support player or a top laner. But it's always helpful to have someone who doesn't have a big ego. And with Hansama being so new to the game and whatnot, he has no real right to have a big ego anyways. So that kind of helps in that degree to keep the peace inside of the team. It's not all about Hansama. It's not the Hansama show. So it's really great to have that little piece of team morale within the team to make sure that things don't get too hectic and heads don't butt too often. So he'll most likely fulfill that role as well too. Now, going into the jungle position, Maxlore has been considered as one of the best junglers in EU, if not the best jungler in EU. Now, everyone talks about his cerebral pathing and ability to where he needs to be on the map, and I haven't really studied Hansama that much when it comes to his jungle routes and, if he goes into and takes Dragon at a specific time or his route matching the enemy jungler, but there's a reason as to why people consider this guy one of the top tier junglers in EU. It's because he can play multiple different styles. He could play that aggro jungler, of Kindred or something, or he could play tanks as well too, like say Juani or Zac or Gragas, and then he can play hyper carries as well too, like Kindred, right? So he can play all these different styles. So, and that's incredibly valuable. This is one of the positions to where you want some of the most flexibility as possible, because as we know, Riot likes to change the jungle every year. So having someone like Maxlore as your jungler will help tremendously when metas shift and things change up and you have to change kind of your team damage output based upon those patch changes. So it's really good to have someone like Maxlore within the jungle position. And then you also have to think his flexibility also works well with Soaz, because Soaz can play tanks, he can play carries, so you can switch off between the two depending on which one is most optimal based upon the patch. And then so now you can have team fights. If you want to play the team fight style of front to back, you can do that with this entire lineup because they're capable of doing that with either Soaz or Maxlore on a tank. Or if the meta is scaling mids, then maybe you want someone that can hop on a early game champion in the jungle and make things happen in the early game so that you can actually get towards the mid and late game and allow someone like Febiven to pilot the Azir or pilot a Victor or something. And Febiven coming into this is one of the biggest question marks. And you would think it wouldn't be a question mark because Febiven's pedigree is pretty high. He's a pretty exceptional mid laner, but he has something to prove this year because he was on Clutch Gaming before in North America, and they really didn't do too hot. And yeah, sure, you can say they got into playoffs and everything in spring, and they did quite well, but when looking at the actual team and their play style, it wasn't that impressive at all. Like the team would often stall out games long enough for Febiven to carry, and then they would just let him carry. So they were simply the team's main win condition. So it just seemed like he was this crutch, and then oftentimes he couldn't actually pull the team through to the finish line. So he's got a lot to prove when it comes to the squad and when it comes to Misfits, because people have a short-term memory and they'll just be like, I don't care how well you were doing in Fnatic, your clutch gaming stint wasn't that great, and you showed us that you aren't actually one of the best mid laners when you were in North America. So I think Febiven coming back into Europe will allow him to focus more on the game, because he's in a comfortable environment. You know, he has his girlfriend over there, he has his family, he has his friends, and, you know, all the interviews and him saying that, yeah, I don't really like my life in North America. You know, I have no friends over here. So it seems like he'll be in a better mindset when it comes to, you know, returning to Europe. So that should inherently just up his level and up his gameplay. So we can expect that mentality boost from him. And then also his previous stint with Reignover, and if you look at Reignover's style, was mostly control. And that's when he was flourishing. So when you look at MaxLore's style, which can go towards that control style, you can see that this pairing of MaxLore and Febiven can actually work out quite well. And I'm excited to see how that kind of dynamic works out, and if Febiven can change MaxLore and make him play to the playstyle that he wants, along with, you know, having maybe Soaz as being resourceless as he usually is within his lineups of Fnatic. So now you go towards Soaz, speaking of which, he's the rock that ties everything together, right? He's the guy that can play tanks, he can play carries, he can play everything that you need him to play. And he is really just immune to meta changes. He's the guy that is just like, okay, anything that you need me to play, I will play, and I will also function on it without a whole lot of resources. So he's the guy to where you can be like, okay, well, what is the last piece that we need to finish out this Misfits roster? And it's like, yeah, you need some stability. You need someone that will survive no matter the meta changes and no matter who he's facing against. So he's always been a top tier top laner. So you can expect that within this Misfits lineup, and I don't think anyone is worried about that. So he's willing to sacrifice resources to everywhere else on the map, and I think that's one of Soaz's biggest strengths, along with just functioning extremely well with limited resources. I mean, how many times have we seen Soaz outplay 1v2 while the rest of his Fnatic team gets something else on the rest of the map? So I think he's going to function really well within this team. I think this team has threats in basically all lanes. When you just look at the entire lineup, a versatile jungler, a proven support, stated carries. The only real big question is if MaxLore and Gorilla will be able to coordinate together. So, I mean, overall, this team is a solid lineup and doesn't really have any glaring weaknesses and should do considerably well in the spring split for 2019 season.